Start taking your seats for those who are still gathering around the food. For those of you coming in, there's a lot of food, so grab a lot of meat. And I will just begin the night with introducing our guest speakers. To the right of me, we have Dr. Joyce Lee, as well as Dr. Jeremy Teal. I'm just going to read their biography. It's very lengthy. It's very... No, it's very impressive, so I want to do it justice. So Dr. Joyce Lee is a care of elderly physician at Northwick General Hospital. She holds a BSc in pharmacy and an MD from the University of Toronto, and a fellowship in care of the elderly from McGill University. And Dr. Jeremy Teal is a staff gastroenterologist and the Chief Medical Information Officer at Northwick General. He holds an MD from U of T with a fellowship in internal medicine, gastroenterology, and an internship in health informatics from Harvard. Yeah, I feel bad about myself. Doctors Lee and Teal are parents of a 4-year-old girl. On top of that, you have a 4-year-old girl? Okay. They are concerned about the effects of climate change and what kind of world their daughter will inherit. They're committed to travel to Mexico City to train under the Nobel laureate Al Gore in March 2018 and became climate reality leaders. They now give educational presentations about climate change to healthcare providers, business leaders, and community groups. Their goal is to share the scientific certainty, the immediacy, and the impacts of climate crisis while inspiring people to act on this important issue. So without further ado, we'll open up the stage to both doctors. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting us tonight. And I'll start. So tonight we're going to talk about climate change, but before we delve into that, I'd like you to just close your eyes for 30 seconds and think about something that is closest and dearest to your heart. Think about your most treasured memories from the past summer and hold that in your thoughts as we go through our deck.
What's all you're saying about felt, where,
who you were with? Okay. So as Christina said, we're physicians, so we're very concerned about health. And the Lancet, which is a very reputable medical journal, has said that climate change is the greatest global health threat of our time. Just a quick review of the science of climate change. The sun emits solar radiation in the form of light waves. It passes through our atmosphere and hits the surface of the Earth. Most of the radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface and warms it. Some of it does bounce back and is radiated back into space in the form of infrared waves. And some of the outgoing radiation is trapped by the Earth's atmosphere and continues to warm the Earth. Depending on what is in our atmosphere, in particular what we call greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane, more and more of this outgoing infrared radiation is trapped. To illustrate how important these greenhouse gases are, we can see that there's Venus and our Earth. Venus has a very thick atmosphere with a lot of greenhouse gases. And rather than a temperate 15 degrees, Venus is 457 degrees. You can melt metal on that. In contrast, Mercury, which basically has a very, very thin atmosphere, is much closer to the sun, but it's only 167 degrees. You might have heard that a lot of people say that, well, you know, the world is not actually warming. It's gone through cycles of this before, and it's just going to happen again. But the science is actually very clear that over the past 650,000 years, the amount of atmospheric CO2, carbon dioxide, has never been above that green line until now. So yes, it has gone through cycles, and we know this from drilling down to all the ice layers in the Arctic, and we can actually see the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere during different points in time. Since the Industrial Revolution in 1950, the burning of fossil fuels has contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, our current level is going up and up and up. It is now at 408 parts per million, which it has never been this high before in the history of Earth. As a result, our summer temperatures have shifted. This is from 1950 to 1980. And you can see over each decade is shifting more and more to the right. And this results in more extreme heat on the Earth's surface. Now, the extreme temperature events, which used to only cover about 0.1% of the Earth, now it covers up to 15% of our Earth. In fact, 17 of the 18 hottest years on record have occurred since 2001. And the hottest 4 years have been the past few years. This is also happening in Canada. And in fact, Canada is warming at a higher rate than tropical zones. The average temperature of Canada has risen 1.5 degrees since the Industrial Revolution. This shows you that in the years since 1950, our global temperature has been in the red, has been going higher and higher. And we know that the largest source of global warming pollution or greenhouse gases is the burning of fossil fuels. This is just science. Now, if the science is so clear, why are world leaders standing up, such as Mr. Trump, saying that man-made global warming is a hoax?
Thanks, Joyce. Now, you may or may not respect Mr. Trump, but Mr. Trump is not the only world leader who has been denying the importance of climate change. Even here in Ontario, our current premier really doesn't recognize how important this issue is for our province and for our country. And maybe part of the reason is if you don't think about the science and you just stand back and you look at our planet from space, you think, this planet is massive. We're just tiny little beings on the surface of the planet. How could we possibly actually change our climate, our atmosphere? It seems almost impossible. And that notion, that disbelief has been capitalized upon. The oil industry is the most powerful and the most well-financed, deep-pocketed industry in the world. And the people that are running these companies have recognized decades ago that there is a direct impact on our climate. And they have been funding uncertainty and doubt. They have been creating doubt in the political and the public space to make people disbelieve that climate science is real. And I'm not making this up. This is not fake news. This is the real thing, and I have facts to back it up. These companies here have been paying front groups and think tanks, paying so-called quote-unquote experts to stand in front of media, to post on social media, and to pay off politicians. So these companies have also bought political campaigns for, in fact, the majority of members of both houses of U.S. Congress. The red dots represent representatives who have directly been funded by the oil industry in their campaigns. So you can imagine trying to pass any sort of bill through this government that tries to recognize how serious climate change is and how we need to get off fossil fuels. It's not possible when more than half of both houses don't even want to believe that it's real. And so we have a divided public, we have political paralysis, and we have the inability for humanity to recognize this existential threat. What's very strange is that there's this concept of a consensus gap. If you ask the scientists, 97% of them concur that climate change is caused by humans. And this is based on almost 12,000 peer-reviewed journal articles just between 1991 and 2011. There have been many more published since then. In fact, there's so much consensus on this that the strength of this scientific data is as strong as smoking is connected to cancer. This is not in question at all. And yet when you ask the public, only about 55% of people that you ask on the street will say that climate change is actually caused by humans. The rest of the people don't really believe it. They think it's just perhaps, you know, a regular cycle in the earth, as Joyce was mentioning earlier. And again, this is because of that constant funding, millions of dollars a year that these oil companies are putting into sowing doubt in our minds. Now, you may still think I'm some sort of a conspiracy theorist. Has this type of influence ever been used before to delay a health threat or response to a health threat? Can you think of one? A few of you are nodding. Smoking, absolutely. I'll pay you later, thanks. Yeah, so big tobacco did the exact same thing that big oil has done. And they also paid think tanks. In fact, some of the very same individuals and the same think tanks that were being paid by big tobacco are now being paid by big oil to do the exact same thing. Fraser Institute is one of them, and they have a branch here in Canada. They publish some data around educational scores for schools, so they do have some more legitimate arms, but they are directly paid. They were paid by big tobacco back in the late 1990s. They were publishing articles saying, secondhand smoke is really not carcinogenic. And they were also running conferences saying, government should just butt out. They shouldn't be regulating smoking and smokers because smoking is not harmful for our health. For real. So if we take a scriptural bent to this for a moment, in Proverbs 1, it says, these people set an ambush for themselves. They are trying to get themselves killed. Such is the fate of all who are greedy for money. It robs them of life. The people that are running in these think tanks are just as aware as anyone else of the science, but they choose to ignore it because they're being paid to play a game with our minds. This misinformation is also presented around climate change. So here's an example of an article from the Financial Post that was published by Lawrence Solomon. Lawrence Solomon is a columnist for the Financial Post. He also is the executive director of a group called Energy Probe. Energy Probe is a known climate denial organization and has received direct funding from oil companies. This person has an ability to publish in a newspaper and publish his opinions as if they are fact. Here's another article that was published by Fraser Institute that was republished in the Financial Post saying that, Doug Ford, he's a really great guy because he's recognized that climate change is not a big deal and we shouldn't be wasting public money on trying to fight it. Fraser Institute also received direct funding from oil companies. So if we take another piece of scripture from Job, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Now, this is just a little excerpt, but I think looking at this in the context of what I've just shown you, essentially there is active denial of science going on here. And at least as far as Joyce and I are concerned, we look at science, the way we reconcile it with our faith, is that science is just the divination or the study of understanding the laws that God created for the universe. And so science already tells us with greater than 97% certainty that climate change is being caused by humans. And so if people are denying that science, they're essentially denying the code by which God has created the world and the rules under which it must operate. And so it is hubris and active denial of God's creation to say that these things don't exist and we should just ignore them. Every National Academy of Science of every major country in the world confirms that global warming is caused by humans. It's anthropogenic, including good old Canada. So we are the causes of the changes that we've seen. And maybe it's not so strange because although I showed you that picture of the Earth from far away before, this is another picture of the Earth just looking at the atmosphere only. If you were to take the planet to scale and shrink it down to the size of a basketball, the thickness of our atmosphere would be the thickness of saran wrap on that basketball. So that is a very, very thin layer that we are affecting with burning of fossil fuels. And we are actually adding the heat energy equivalent to 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs into the atmosphere every single day of the year. So when you start to put the facts together, it's pretty clear we are really affecting our planet. And so as Joyce said before, the Lancet has recognized that this is an unacceptably high risk to human health and potentially catastrophic. And now we'd like to go through some of the effects of climate change on our planet. This interconnected web shows you all the different pieces that get affected, and some of them are more direct effects. The ones further down, like political instability, damaged infrastructure, food insecurity, affect us on a more immediate level, and certainly the poor and the people that we reach out to as Christians who are more vulnerable to these types of effects. Joyce.
So now we're going to go through temperature extremes. You probably all remember last year during the heat wave, almost 100 people died in Quebec. We don't know how many people died in Ontario because we don't keep track of those statistics in the same way. And in Tokyo, Japan, around the same time, they had a terrible heat wave as well. 125 people died, and over 57,000 people went to emergency department. Now, can you imagine, some of us are healthcare workers here, can you imagine that many people showing up in Emerge? And we know that there's increasing exposure to heat waves with climate change. Now, it is affecting more than 150 million people per year. In addition, each of the heat waves are now longer. It is generally 35% longer globally. We see some examples in Australia here. This temperature in Sydney here reached 47 degrees. It was the city's hottest day in almost 80 years. There's a traffic alert in the province of Victoria in Australia that there is a 10-kilometer stretch of road that was melting. And in Pakistan in 2015, this is a morgue showing the people who died in the heat wave. 1,200 people died in that heat wave. It was so bad that the year after, they started digging mass graves in anticipation of more deaths from heat waves. Heat waves worldwide have claimed more than 79 million deaths in the past 25 years. And this is only data from 20 countries which have accumulated accurate data. This is not including any data in Africa at all. The locations of these heat waves are definitely spreading. And if we continue business as usual, we're going to see 3 times to 20 times increase in these heat waves in the next 50 years. Now let's take a look at what is happening in the Arctic area. On February 25th, 2018, the temperature at the North Pole was 28 degrees Celsius warmer than normal. The effect of that is that the polar vortex, which normally sits over the North Pole, was split into 2, bringing very cold air to parts of Europe and North America. The normal jet stream looks like this. With climate change and the warming at the North Pole, the jet stream now looks like this, splitting the polar vortex, leading to scenes such as this in Rome, Italy, and in London, England, and in Dublin. As a result of climate change, we're seeing very unusual weather patterns here. We see that the Arctic coast in Alaska was very warm, while at the same time, Lakeville, Oregon was at -33. In fact, it was so warm during this period of time that people were sunbathing in Alaska because it was 35 degrees.
So when you hear our friend Mr. Trump in the States saying, I'm going to take away my mic because he yells and doesn't need a mic, I don't have the right hair. But so you can see from what we just showed you there that actually global warming or climate change doesn't just cause hot temperatures, it also causes extreme cold temperatures because of this disruption in the jet stream and pushing of the polar vortex in places it shouldn't go. So even just this past week, the fluctuation that we're seeing where it's -27 and then it's going to be +6 tomorrow, that's climate change. So let's talk about sea level rise and other effects on the water cycle. The water cycle is profoundly affected by climate change because you may not know this, but most of the extra heat energy that we're trapping because of climate change goes into the ocean, not the air. 93% of that temperature, as a matter of fact. And so what we're seeing in the oceans is similar to what we saw in the air, even though it takes a lot more heat energy to rise the temperature of water compared to air. The temperature anomalies are going way above normal. And so when we look at something like the Arctic sea ice, this is what the Arctic sea ice looked like in 1984, and this is what it looked like in 2012. I don't know about you, but when I look at the difference between these two pictures, I get a little bit of a chill down my spine, because this ain't normal, folks. As a result of this melting of the polar ice caps, what's happening is that the sea level is actually rising. And 1/3 of the world's population lives within only 100 kilometers of a coastline. And so we have populations, and not to mention trillions of dollars of real estate assets that are in direct threat from sea level rise. In fact, even today, without any further sea level rise, $129 billion of real estate assets in New York is already lying in a flood zone. Here's Miami Beach. This is actually business as usual in Miami Beach. What you're seeing here is something called high tide flooding. And this happens at high tide on a regular basis in Miami. And the people there have just gotten used to it, and they just go about their business. Oh yeah, it's totally normal to drive my car through 2 feet of water every day. This is adaptation. As temperatures increase, the oceans evaporate more moisture into the sky as well. And in fact, with each additional 1 degree Celsius of global temperature change, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water vapor. That may sound like a pretty boring science statistic, but this is the downstream effect of that change. What we're looking at here in this video, this is a time-lapse video of something called an urban rain bomb. This is a meteorologic phenomenon which is becoming more common because of climate change. Look at the amount of water coming down over top of this town. This is as a result of the warmer air being able to hold more moisture, and also the warmer oceans evapotranspirating more water than it used to. Now this is going to be loud, I apologize. Just look at this. Sorry. Look at across the street. You can't even see the houses across the street.
This is nuts! Oh my God! I've never seen it.
That's like Book of Revelation type stuff here. I mean, that is a ridiculous amount of water. This picture here, this is in Argentina. This is in only 15 minutes, 4.9 feet of hail came down on this highway, completely paralyzing the traffic. Yeah, Book of Revelation for sure. Global record-breaking precipitation anomalies are becoming more and more common. And in fact, already, floods and extreme rainfall events are 4 times more common than they were in 1980. Here's some examples here in Canada. Maybe you remember the big flood that happened in downtown Calgary, $6 billion in damage. In Toronto here in 2013, $850 million in damage from flooding. And then again, just this past August, we had another flood. I don't even know if they've totaled up all the insurance claims from that one yet. Rainfall anomalies in Canada are also increasing, just as you're seeing globally. And North America could see a 400% increase in extreme downpours by the end of this century.
And now, just to depress you more, we will talk about drought and wildfires. So the same extra heat that's evaporating water from the oceans is also evaporating water from our earth, from the land. And this is causing deeper and longer droughts. You remember what happened in Cape Town. They almost ran out of water last year. This is a lake in California, and of course California has had the worst drought in the last 600 years, in the last few years. If we continue business as usual, burning fossil fuels, much of the arable land in North America is going to turn to desert and can no longer support agriculture. Water scarcity is already affecting more than 40% of the world's population. This is a lake in Iran over the years. At the current rate of groundwater depletion, about 1/3 of the southern high plains of the US will not be able to support irrigation by 2040. That's very soon. This is the breadbasket of the US. And of course, this has already happened in some parts of the world. The Syrian farmer had 400 acres of wheat and it was all turned into desert because of the worst drought they have experienced. The drought in between 2006 and 2010 turned 60% of Syria's land into desert, and it drove 1.5 million people who no longer have a livelihood into Syria's already crowded cities, destabilizing an already unstable situation, leading to the Syrian refugee crisis. If we think a few million refugees are bad, and we all remember how much we wanted to help the refugees because of that picture of the little boy, imagine by 2050, because of climate change, we could end up with 143 million climate refugees. Now, where are these people going to go? We know the hotter years are associated with more forest fires. So forest fires are happening not because of poor forest management, but because of climate change. Because for every degree of warming, lightning strikes actually increase 10 to 12%. In Moscow, Russia, there were 25,000 fires in 2010, resulting in 55,000 deaths. 55,000 people died. The amount of carbon monoxide over Western Russia during this period was so bad that it basically choked out a lot of the agriculture. A few months later, world food prices reached a record high because Russia had to halt grain exports. So this, you can see, is linked to food insecurity. This is an example of a food price protest in Pakistan. And I'd like to point out that, as the Pope has said, Pope Francis, the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. We can see that the people in countries that are developing who have poor infrastructure, they really have no reserve to deal with this sort of climate catastrophe. And we know that places such as Puerto Rico, that was hit by a terrible hurricane, they are still trying to recover. An example in Canada from wildfires, we remember what happened in Fort McMurray in 2016. Imagine yourself being in one of those cars, driving away. And of course, British Columbia had terrible wildfires last year. Now, my in-laws live in British Columbia. And in certain parts of BC, because of the forest fires and the terrible air quality, people could not leave their homes for the whole summer. Children, elderly, and people who have respiratory conditions such as asthma. And during this period of time, British Columbia actually had the worst air quality in the world, even worse than India, if you can believe it. We know the average amount of land burned in Canada due to wildfires has doubled since the 1970s. The professor of wildfires in Alberta has said that we expect that these fires will continue to double and quadruple over the next century. And he's quite clear in saying that this is because of human-caused climate change.
But wait, there's more. Let's talk about storms. All right, so how does the climate crisis impact hurricanes? Well, we already talked before about how most of the temperature change that happens from climate or the warming actually goes into the ocean and not the air. So the warmer oceans lead to more intense hurricanes because you've got more heat energy there to drive the storm. These hurricanes also intensify much more rapidly than they did before, so we have much less time to prepare for these disasters when they occur. Warmer air holds more moisture, so you get more flooding than you would before, and because sea level is already higher than it was before, the storm surge is also higher and hitting more buildings inland than before. And lastly, a really interesting meteorologic phenomenon where in climate change the jet stream becomes wavier, and that causes certain weather patterns to stay in one place longer. This leads to longer droughts, longer periods of precipitation, and storms like hurricanes sit in one place a lot longer than they used to. Let's take the example of Hurricane Sandy for a moment. You may remember back in 2012, this was called Superstorm Sandy. It sounded really cool in the media. These days, it's just kind of an average storm, but back then it was pretty super. There was a lot of infrastructure damage in Manhattan, as you remember. And here's a little video.
Manhattan. We can measure this precisely, just as the scientists could predict precisely how much water would breach the levees in New Orleans. The area where the World Trade Center Memorial is to be located would be underwater.
The Hudson River, downtown Manhattan, was literally pouring into the ground zero site.
So the lesson here is that the scientists can predict very, very clearly where this flooding can happen and what danger zones exist. We need to stop listening to the deniers because they're wrong and they have an ulterior motive, which is to make money and to be greedy rather than save our lives, our livelihood, and our infrastructure. Global warming is contributing to an increased incidence of extreme weather because the environment in which all storms form has changed from human activities. Now, this is a meteorologist speaking, but I'll try to translate. What he's saying here is that we cannot attribute any one storm to climate change directly, but what we can say is that every storm is now magnified because of climate change. What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at that example of Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy back in 1880 was a 1 in 500 year storm. It was a landmark event. But because of climate change and because of the changes in the ocean and the air, that's now a 1 in 25 year storm. And if we continue burning fossil fuels the way we are now, by 2030 to 2045, a storm like Superstorm Sandy will happen once every 5 years. I don't think we can even possibly rebuild if we have to rebuild every 5 years. Or why would we even bother? Here's another example with Hurricane Harvey that happened in 2017. When Hurricane Harvey crossed the Gulf of Mexico, the water that it traversed was 4 degrees Celsius hotter than normal, up to 200 meters deep. That might not sound like a lot, but it takes a whole lot of heat energy to transfer temperature of 4 degrees Celsius in a huge body of water like the Gulf of Mexico. What happened as a result of that is that the storm intensified from a tropical depression to a Category 4 in only 2 days. So this left very little time for people to respond to the disaster. It was the first recorded storm in the Gulf of Mexico to intensify in the 12 hours before landfall. And here's that wavy jet stream that I was talking about earlier. So because weather patterns now, as a result, tend to stick in one place longer, this is what happened with Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey moved inland part way, but then it stopped because of that disruption in the jet stream. It didn't continue to move inland as most hurricanes do. So as a result, what you can see here, if I can use my little laser pointer, is that part of the storm sat on top of the Gulf of Mexico and the other part of the storm was sitting on top of southern Texas. So essentially what was happening is the storm was just vacuuming up water from the Gulf of Mexico and dumping it onto the land, rinse, lather, repeat. So as a result, this was the largest amount of rainfall ever recorded in the US, 5.4 feet of rain. And so that's why we saw examples like this where people were trapped in their nursing home and couldn't even get out. The amount of rain is just preposterous. This is biblical proportions, okay? A 1 in 25,000 year event, and in some parts of Texas, a 1 in 500,000 year event. I don't even know how you measure that because none of us were doing meteorology 500,000 years ago, but nevertheless, it's a lot of rain. So these types of catastrophes are increasing in frequency and in severity. In 2017, the overall losses from weather disasters totaled $320 billion in the world economy. Joyce.
Okay, so we've gone through the direct effects of climate change. Climate change is also affecting health through many other ways, and those include infectious diseases, mental health, allergens, and air pollution. We'll go through some of these in a minute. So we'll talk about allergies for a minute. A lot of us, I'm sure, have allergies. I do. And allergies are going to get much worse. In year 2000, the grains of pollen per cubic meter was about 8,000. By 2040, it's going to almost triple. More carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and hotter temperatures also mean more aggressive poison ivy. And in fact, today is producing about 40 milligrams of toxic oil. And by 2060 to 2070, it's going to produce almost double that amount. Air pollution. Now, we're lucky that we live in Canada, that our air is generally not horrible, but worldwide it's a huge problem. Every year, air pollution from fossil fuels kills 7 million people. And this is mainly through these sort of molecules called particulate matter PM 2.5, ground level ozone, wildfire smoke, as we talked about earlier, and dust and mold. In particular, PM 2.5 has been very well studied scientifically. It is linked to multiple respiratory conditions like asthma, bronchitis, and acute lung infections, lung cancer, even heart disease and stroke. PM 2.5 actually has been shown to increase the thickness of the lining of arteries, and that is how it can increase the risk of strokes and heart disease. And with this also, of course, there's effects on mental health, which we'll go through. This is Beijing on a clear day. You can see the buildings there. On a not so clear day. This is a regular occurrence in China. And in this particular occasion, the headmaster at the school had to be suspended because he made the children write an exam outdoors in this sort of smoggy condition. And of course, this sort of air pollution and due to climate change is affecting the elderly, the children, and people who have disabilities and already pre-existing health issues the most. China's air pollution is cutting life expectancy by an average of 5.5 years in the north of the country. And the Academy of Social Sciences in Shanghai said that when the pollution index is near extreme level in Beijing, the city is no longer livable for human beings. This is a huge problem. The cost of mortality from outdoor air pollution is, of course, really high in China, consuming up to 12% of their GDP. In Canada, it's sitting around 2%. So we still do have a problem in Canada, especially in big cities like Toronto. In fact, the annual premature deaths from the amount of PM 2.5 in our air in Canada is estimated to cause around 7,000 deaths in 2015, which results in the economic loss of $53 billion. Next, we're going to talk about infectious diseases. Now, vectors for infectious diseases that we used to call tropical diseases are on the move. In medicine, we used to study tropical diseases, but really these diseases are no longer only limited to the tropics because of climate change. You can see that all these conditions like Zika virus and West Nile virus, dengue fever, everything is on the move. The number of mosquito-borne infections in the US has increased 10 times over the last decade, and tick-borne diseases such as Lyme disease have more than doubled. Because of climate change, all these vectors for infectious diseases are moving north and moving to higher altitudes to the degree that we now really have to worry about Lyme disease on a regular basis in the summer. Even malaria is possible in Canada. We had some malaria at the turn of the century, but now with climate change, if the transmission conditions, including competent vectors, infected humans, and the suitable climate for transmission, it is actually possible that we can have up to 300 million of malaria cases in Canada by 2080. This is according to the Canadian Medical Association. Now let's move on to mental health, as I'm sure you're all feeling a little anxious and depressed right now about the state of affairs in our planet. And this is the reason why we're doing this, because we're feeling quite anxious and depressed ourselves. We have to do something about this. Now, of course, with all the natural disasters and extreme weather events, the people that are going through them are having acute stress disorder, and also post-traumatic stress disorder. And in fact, it's interesting that with every 1 degree in temperature rise, there's a 1% increase in suicide deaths. And also aggression tends to increase with higher temperatures. There's a 3 to 6 times increase in violent crime and assaults with increasing global temperatures. You may have heard of this term before, solastalgia. There's been a bit of coverage in the media these days. Solastalgia is defined as an existential distress caused by environmental change, according to Wikipedia. And according to other sources, is basically feeling homesick when you're still at home. When we're still here on our planet, but we're feeling homesick for our paradise, and we recognize this is no longer paradise. And to us, it also means sort of a loss of hope. We're all fueled by hope for the future, for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, for future generations. And with all this stuff happening, I think there's a sense of loss of hope. And when we see all the human suffering, especially the human suffering that is inflicted by burning fossil fuels and climate change onto the poor and vulnerable people of the world, I think we all feel a little bit guilty, and there's despair and grief. This is a normal human response to seeing suffering.
So if we total up all the costs of burning carbon to drive our economy and all the downstream effects that are going to happen to us, we have to really stop and think, do we need to stop doing this? And do we need to stop doing it now? It's actually been called the #1 threat to the global economy. If you look at costs of climate change in Canada, just looking at insurable losses from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, 2 decades ago, it cost about $400 million a year to service all of those claims. Now it's $1.5 billion per year. The Federal Disaster Relief Agency here in Canada was funded to $100 million a year 2 decades ago, and now it's $2 billion. So already climate change, just from trying to recover from natural disasters, never mind all the other stuff, is over $3.5 billion per year. And it's estimated that at the current rate of change, climate change could cost Canada $21 to $43 billion per year. I'm not really sure where we're going to get all that money from. Mark Carney, you may remember him. He's a very famous economist from Canada who's now moved on to England. He says the vast majority of carbon reserves are unburnable. What does he mean by that? Well, he's actually referring to something called the subprime carbon bubble. You remember back 10 years ago when we had a huge economic crash and it was because of subprime mortgages? This is the same idea, except it's subprime carbon. How does that work? Well, imagine that this gray sphere here is all the amount of fossil fuels that we burned since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which resulted in about 1821 gigatons of CO2 being released to the atmosphere. Now, this red bubble here is showing all of the remaining fossil fuel reserves that oil companies already know exist and are already on their books as assets. If we actually want to keep our climate, so right now we're about 1.1 degrees on the planet over what our temperature average used to be. The Paris Accord is telling us that we need to stay under 2 degrees Celsius of warming to avoid the major disastrous effects of climate change. So what this bubble is showing us here is that this gray area is the remaining fossil fuels we can actually burn and still stay under 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. Everything outside this is not burnable unless we plan on not having a planet anymore that we can actually live on. So that means that $22 trillion of assets already on the books of oil companies is unburnable. That money is money they should be writing off on their books to say, we can't profit from this, we can't use this. Now you can see why oil companies are fighting tooth and nail behind the scenes. It's cheap for them to put, 50 million, 100 million into social media and think tanks and buying off politicians rather than writing off $22 trillion in assets. So we need to think about this because human societies before us, who were already pretty advanced, crashed and evaporated because they exceeded their environmental capacity. That's what happened on Easter Island. And Pope Francis has reminded us of this. If we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. We can't live in a falsehood anymore. This is not a sustainable lifestyle. The Lord God took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. We are meant to be custodians of the planet that God gave us. We're not being very good custodians right now. How bad is it? Well, there was a report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in October 2018. This was a group of 6,000 scientific references and 91 authors from 40 countries. Their job was to go away after the Paris Accord and say, okay, the Paris Accord said we have to stay under 2 degrees Celsius of warming on the planet, but our aspirational goal was to stick to 1.5. So is it okay to exceed 1.5 and go to 2, or should we really be aiming for 1.5? That was the purpose of this study. And what they said is that every bit of extra warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius matters, because we are getting into a territory of risk of irreversible change. What this means is we're going to hit a tipping point where there is no return. And we're going to start to get positive feedback loops that even if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, the positive feedback loops will keep on releasing more greenhouse gases. Example, the permafrost in the Arctic is melting. Underneath the permafrost are thousands to millions of years of dead animals that have decayed there, and there's a bunch of methane under the permafrost. When the permafrost melts, the methane bubbles burst and explode and release a whole bunch of greenhouse gas. And methane is something like 30 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. Also, because the polar ice caps are melting, the polar ice caps are white. We all know that white reflects light and reflects the sun's energy back into space. When those melt off completely, we have dark ocean replacing that light-colored ice and snow. That absorbs heat. That's another positive feedback loop. So, limiting global warming to 1.5 is really what we should be shooting for, but this requires far-reaching and unprecedented change in all aspects of society. This means we need to aim to greenhouse gas, oh, I sound like marijuana. No. Greenhouse gas emissions would need to fall 45% below 2010 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So we have to have a completely sustainable economy by 2050, not burning any fossil fuels. So we have 12 years to turn the corner, to make it or break it. So when you hear people talking in the street about, oh, this is something that's going to affect my grandkids, I don't need to worry about it, they're dead wrong. It's affecting us now, and we got to change now. So we have an addiction. Just like to drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes, we have an addiction to fossil fuel. But there is hope. So we're going to turn the corner now. We're going to talk about some happy things. Because we made you all so sad, you probably all need Kleenex. I'm sorry. All right, so the cost of starting a new power plant today, if you were a company that was going to generate electricity, it's actually way cheaper to start your power plant as a solar or a wind plant than it is to use natural gas, coal, or nuclear. And this is because the cost of these... Anyone want popcorn? The cost of these systems has dropped dramatically because we've already been improving the technology and getting economy of scale. Did you know that wind power could actually supply all of the world's electricity needs 40 times over? And in 2000, we thought that we would produce approximately 30 gigawatts of wind power by 2010, and in reality, we've already exceeded that by a factor of 18 times. That's because the cost of wind power has dramatically dropped over the last few decades. In fact, in some parts of the world now, this is an example in Texas, the renewable energy is so effective that they can give electricity away at night. Imagine if Kathleen Wynne had been able to take advantage of that. But anyway, enough solar energy reaches the Earth every hour to fulfill all the world's electricity needs for a year. There's a lot of energy coming from that sun that we can harness. In 2002, we expected the solar energy market would only grow by 1 gigawatt by 2010, and in reality, we exceeded that goal by 17 times, and by 2017, by 98 times. So solar is going gangbusters. This is again because the cost of solar cells has dropped precipitously since they were first invented in 1976. As a result, world solar photovoltaic installations have been increasing with a big hockey stick, an exponential change, and look at what's happening here in India. This is really cool. I like this graph. Nope, up, no, higher, 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 keep going. Yeah. That's some serious change. And why is that happening? Well, it's because it's a leapfrog technology. Think back to when we didn't have iPhones and we didn't have Android, you know, and nobody had mobile phones. There was basically a 12-year period. Like when AT&T first started to do a business model of how many wireless phones they could sell, they thought they'd be able to sell like a few 100,000, and that was it, right? I mean, in 12 years, we completely changed the world. And in parts of the world like this, in developing countries where they don't have any infrastructure for telephone, they were able to leapfrog that and empower themselves with communication technology. Now it's the same with electricity generation. You can democratize electricity generation in these countries. Places in India where they're still burning dung and kerosene to heat their homes and to cook their food, they don't need somebody to come in and build a new power plant. They can just pop a solar panel up on their roof and generate their own power. And now it's actually cost effective to do that. Here's another example in Sierra Leone where these children are learning off laptops that are solar powered. Let's talk about electricity in mobility for a moment. So it turns out that the cost parity point for electric cars versus fossil fuel powered cars is coming in 2023. So that means when you go down the street to a car company, you could buy a new car that's electric powered and it would cost the same as a fossil fuel powered car in just a few years. And on top of that, you don't have to pay for gas. You don't have to pay for oil changes. There's only 100 parts in an electric car instead of something like 5,000 parts in a fossil fuel powered car. So the electricity cost is cheaper than gas. The maintenance is cheaper. It costs the same to buy. Why wouldn't you do it, right? So that's coming. We're seeing electric cars are increasing on the road already. And actually many countries now are saying, we're going to phase out. You will not be able to buy a fossil fuel powered car anymore in our country as of these dates, including good old British Columbia. And the auto manufacturers are all recognizing this. All these companies are working on producing electric cars. Maybe one of your favorite car brands is on here. And people are getting ticked off about this. We need public outrage. We need people to stand up. And no one does outrage better than the Quebecois, let's face it. So, in November 2010, 50,000 people. Have you ever seen any protest in Ontario that's 50,000 people? I haven't. But in Quebec, they did it. 50,000 people marched for climate action in Montreal. And they also followed that up with a class action lawsuit against the federal government, young people, your age, under age 35, who said, you are stealing our future. You are not taking this seriously, and we are taking you to court. And they're not the first group of people in the world to start taking action in the court. Why is this? It's because our Canadian greenhouse gas emissions need to be under 385 million tons by 2030, but our targets right now were set by the Harper era, and Trudeau never changed them. So our targets are actually above what we need to be hitting. And this is just for the Paris Accord. That's not even for that IPCC report that I showed you that has to aim even lower. So we're shooting way too low here. And we keep developing pipelines. Let's not even get started about the tar sands. Okay, so what about all of you? So now that we've scared the heck out of you, and we've shown you that, yes, there is some possible hope, what can each of us do? And the good news is, I think there really is something that each one of us can do to make a difference. Let's maybe go back to the Bible here for a minute. So this is from Luke. So then Jesus turned to the crowd and said, when you see clouds beginning to form in the west, you say, here comes a shower. And you're right. When the south wind blows, you say, today will be a scorcher. And it is. You fools, you know how to interpret the weather signs of the earth and sky, but you don't know how to interpret the present times. Why can't you decide for yourselves what is right? Now, of course, there's different ways of interpreting this, but if you put this in the context of climate change, we know how to predict the weather. We know the science. The science is clear. We are cooking ourselves on our own planet, and yet we choose to ignore it. We choose to interpret it in the convenient way. We want to keep living the life that we've been living burning fossil fuels. We need to recognize the inconvenient truth that that is no longer sustainable, and we have to change now. Deuteronomy, I'm calling for the heavens and the earth to be witnesses against you this very day. I'm offering you the choice of life or death. You can choose either blessings or curses, but I want you to choose life. Then you and your children will live. God loves us. God wants us to make the right choice. He doesn't want us to cook ourselves on our own planet. So what actions can we take? Number one is to share and act on the science. We've shared with you tonight the science is indisputable. It's undebatable. please share with your friends, your family, your colleagues the impacts of this climate crisis, and support strong climate policy. This means, regardless of your political affiliation, we should not be making this a wedge issue in Canadian politics, and right now we are. People are arguing about carbon tax, no carbon tax, fossil fuels are not an issue, we should develop pipelines. The science is what should be guiding us, not political ideology. Because it's not going to matter whether you're PC or liberal or green or whatever. The planet's still going to do what it's going to do. So vote for good policy and leaders and act against those that are not recognizing this crisis. Just as a note, the data has already been studied by Nobel Prize winning economists, and carbon pricing is the most effective way for us to get off fossil fuels. That's because it's just like when we tax alcohol or cigarettes. If there's something that we know is harming our health, which this is, then you put a tax on it, and that dissuades people from doing that thing, right? So economists way smarter than us have already figured this out. This is kind of what Trudeau's trying to do. He's doing a lot of other things not so well, but he is trying to do this piece. The PCs are saying, no, 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 we don't need carbon pricing, we're just going to regulate the polluters. Well, that's been tried in other parts of the world, and it's not effective. It doesn't reduce pollution, and it's actually more costly than doing it this way. So, anyway. Why is policy so important? If this is a scientific issue, why do we have to make it political? Well, here's why. Greenhouse gas emissions in the UK went down by 41% between 1990 and 2016. Anyone want to take a guess what ours are like right now? Do we go up or down? See a couple people saying up. Yes, we went up. Fixed it. Canada went up by 17% in that same period of time, and that was mainly because we chose to develop the tar sands. Joyce.
The next action you can take is buy less. So for those of you, well, most of you don't know me, but Teresa's smiling. Some of you may know that I like shopping. But really, I'm shopping a lot less. And when I do shop, I filter my choices through my knowledge about climate change. So before you click buy on Amazon or whichever site you like to shop at, think about it. Do I really need this? Is shopping really a form of therapy? And if you buy less, then you probably don't need to watch Marie Kondo's Netflix special about decluttering.
Number 3 is reduce your carbon footprint. So there are ways besides, for example, the obvious things that you can do to reduce your carbon emissions as a person or as a family. There are companies, for example, that allow you to buy offsets for your home and office. So this company, Bullfrog Power, which is on the internet, we've been using them for almost 15 years now. But you can basically, you punch in how much electricity you use or how much natural gas you use. They charge you a small amount on top of your regular bill, and all that money allows them to inject green energy and green power, green natural gas onto the grid. And they use that money to start new renewable energy projects. If you have investments, divesting them from fossil fuel companies. So taking your money out of mutual funds that invest in fossil fuel companies. It's actually a smart thing to do because that's where the money's going. It's going into the new green economy. It's not going into fossil fuels. Flying is actually really bad for the environment. You may not know this, but one transatlantic flight is actually enough carbon emissions to nullify the beneficial effects of 20 years of recycling. So recycling, it don't cut it anymore. I'm sorry. So if you need to fly, there is a couple of companies here, less.ca and planetair.ca, allow you to buy flight offsets. So what you do is you punch in your source and your destination. It tells you how many tons of CO2 that flight will produce, and you can pay a small fee. What that does is they fund projects that actually sequester or remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So you're essentially balancing out those emissions. So for a flight to Paris return, it's about $48 to offset, so it's not a lot of money. Number 4.
Transition to a plant-based diet. So there are clear health benefits from doing this, and also it reduces your carbon impact a lot. If you're not ready to go vegan at this very moment, and I'm not, just cut out beef. Cutting out beef is not only good for your health, because beef is actually increases the risk of a bunch of other diseases that we don't want, like cancer. It actually reduces your greenhouse gas diet impact by 90%.
In fact, did you know that if you took all the cows in the world and you rounded them up and put them all in one country, and you were to rank the countries globally as to how much greenhouse gases they emit, where do you think cows would be as a country? Take a guess. Anyone? No one's guessing. Number 3. Cows alone would actually be the 3rd biggest country in greenhouse gas emissions. That's a lot of methane. So going back to the beginning of our talk, when you closed your eyes and you thought about your most treasured memory from last year, and you thought about who you were with, what you were doing, we want you to maybe step back for a minute from all these scary facts, because the facts can sort of make you cold and scared and not want to do anything. You have to think back more to what really matters to you, about your family, your friends, your home. Those are the things that are going to make you want to act. And that's where we need to act from, is from our heart. When we started doing these types of presentations, I had to start doing it because honestly I thought I was going to need medication. I was getting so depressed about how nuked our planet was and how I was just contributing to it. I had to act. And for me, and for Joyce, this is what drives us, right? I mean, we're thinking about our little girl. What's the point in trying really hard to help her to learn how to read or pay money to take her to private school or whatever if she's not going to have a planet that she can live on? It's pointless, right? So we have to do something about this. So think about what matters to you, because we can all make a difference. Here's a joint statement from Pope Francis as well as Patriarch Bartholomew. And basically they're saying, together we pledge our commitment to raising awareness about the stewardship of creation for the protection of God's world and the benefit of his people. There's actually a whole encyclical that's been published by the Pope on climate change. It came out in 2014. It's something like 280 pages. He is on fire when it comes to this stuff. He really cares about it. And because he knows that the people who are the most vulnerable, the people that Jesus would want to help more than everybody else, are the vulnerable people, the people who don't have the advantages that we have, and they're the most vulnerable to these changes. So number 5 is don't give up and act from your heart, because every positive action can mitigate climate change. Climate anxiety and depression is a real thing, and actually at New York University, the Student Support Center there has started to prescribe. When students come in and say, I'm feeling really horrible about this, I don't want to go to class, I'm feeling terrible, the best action is not to take medication, it's to take action. That actually is what cures climate anxiety. If you think about it, every day you make about 35,000 choices. If you make those choices through this new knowledge, you can make a difference in the planet that you're on. So zooming back out to our planet, it looks so perfect the way that God made it. So immensely beautiful and so powerful that there's no way that humans could ever do anything big enough to actually wreck it for us to live on. But now you know it's a very delicate ecosphere. We're the first generation that is feeling the effects of climate change, and we're also the last generation that can make a difference before it's too late. Thanks. And maybe just open up a little bit of dialogue. You have a question just to throw up as a starting point here, but really we're open to any. For anyone
wants. Where do we get good data from? Because normally when we have arguments with others, you know, we know the facts, we know what to say. It's just I need some good data.
Yeah. Shortly after we received our training from Al Gore last March, Joyce and I went to a dinner party, and we ended up at that dinner party we were talking to somebody who's, I think I'm near a speaker, we were talking to somebody who's an investment banker in fossil fuels. And we had a very animated discussion. And so sometimes it can be quite difficult you have to choose. One of the things that we learned in our training is that if there's somebody out there who's like a really active denier and they just spit bullets at you anytime you bring this up, you're probably not going to convince them, no matter how much data you bring or how many, you know, scientific studies you show them. It's better to try and use the energy and the time that you have to get this message out to the people who just don't know, right? Who, like, people who aren't necessarily opinionated, but they just don't understand how important and how immediate this problem is. In terms of the data that we've shown, every single one of the slides is referenced, so it's all, none of it's fake news, it's all scientific data based. And we'd be happy if any of you want to communicate over email or whatever, we can send you some information. We can't send you the slide deck because it's like 300 megabytes, but we can send you some data. And we're also available to come and present to other groups that you may know, businesses or schools or any groups that you might be interested in, if that's helpful.
Well, we can prepare a one-pager. A lot of people have requested that, sort of like just a summary, and we can send it out to maybe Christina, and then you can, yeah. Any other questions or comments? There's like, you can go first. Or maybe you should do this.
All right. So the one question I do have is, you did mention electric cars. Now, electric cars, to produce them, and batteries especially, they produce a ton of greenhouse gas compared to, I believe, gasoline cars. I could be mistaken. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Presentation on that. Perfect.
For electric vehicle drivers, because they often get asked that question. Thanks, Joyce. And I'm just going to bring it up here. One moment. I'll show you in 4 slides. I can answer that question. Hold on. The computer's a little bit slow here. But you're right. It's coming up. So you're absolutely right. It does take greenhouse gas to produce an electric car, more than it would to produce a typical gas-powered car. But the trade-off is in the operation of that car over its lifespan. So a typical car you might drive for approximately 15 years, maybe not you personally, but once again, it's handed down across many different people. Okay, so let me start with this slide here. Okay, so electric vehicles are about 95% efficient in converting the power that's in the battery to engine motion, okay? And an ICE vehicle, or internal combustion engine, that's fossil fuel vehicle, is only about 15 to 20% efficient in converting that gas into actual energy. The rest is wasted as heat and exhaust, et cetera, et cetera. So that means, if you look, for example, at a Tesla Model 3, the miles per gallon equivalent is about 130, as compared to a typical gas car, which is about a miles per gallon of 25, okay? So if we put that into a graph, see, it's almost like I knew you were going to ask this question. So here's a typical fossil fuel vehicle, okay? It takes about 10 tons of CO2 to produce that car. And similarly, if you take any of these electric cars, they also, just to produce, you know, the body and the metal and all the other stuff, it's about 10 tons of CO2. But you got this green part, which maybe I shouldn't color green, I should color red, but those are the extra fossil fuel emissions that come from producing the battery. And the battery, the emissions are larger depending on how big the battery is. So a little Leaf, which has a 30 kilowatt hour battery, or a Model S, which has a 100 kilowatt hour battery, there's a difference in the CO2 production. But look at what happens once you start to drive the car. So in 1 year of driving, or about 16,000 kilometers, already that ICE car is almost caught up to the Leaf because of all the emissions that happen from driving it. And after 2 years, you can see already, actually at 1.27 years, the Leaf has already paid itself off in terms of those extra tons of CO2 to produce the battery, as compared to the gas car. That Chevy Bolt is already paid off after 2.5 years. The Model 3 is paid off after 3 years of driving, and the Model S, the big battery, is about 4 years. So if we look at, I'm just gonna, now the other thing that matters is what type of electricity grid you're charging off of, because if you charge in Ontario, actually, what's really cool, you may not know this, but about 96% of our electricity is fossil fuel free right now. Now we do use nuclear, which has other issues, but it doesn't produce a lot of CO2. As compared to like one of the worst examples in the US, where 80% of the electricity that's generated is coming from things like coal, which is of course spewing out tons of CO2. So if you charge an electric car in that part of the country, it's not so good for the environment, but here in Ontario, it's great. So if I'm going to fast forward through this because it's going to be too much information. But, so lifetime emissions are about 60% lower. So here's the graph. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So an electric car compared to an ICE vehicle over its lifespan of, sorry, this is 10 years of driving, so 160,000 kilometers, is about 60% less CO2 emissions, cradle to grave, including producing the battery. Yep, got a slide right here on that. So a typical Tesla battery, and I've just used this as an example, but they have crowdsourced data showing that that battery is going to last 300 to 500,000 kilometers. And they use only about 7% lithium and 3% cobalt. And we can already reclaim about 95% plus of nickel, copper, and cobalt from electric vehicle batteries. The only one they're still working on is lithium. But basically what they're saying is as the technology continues to advance, the need for new mines will be minimal because they can just do closed loop recycling on all of those rare earth metals. It'll actually get down to only about 1.5 tons of CO2 emissions for a 100 kilowatt hour battery as opposed to about 12 tons right now because of more efficient recycling, driving all of their factories off renewable energy and all that good stuff. So electric's the way to go for sure.
I think you want to say anything? Okay.
This is great information. I'm so amazed with that amount of information, but I just have a comment regarding politicians. Politicians agree there is a global warming issue. They're not against it. But collecting money from people and putting it without knowing where it's going to go, that's the issue. But Ford, for example, is not against global warming, but against taking the money from people and put it in the hands of people. We don't know what they're going to do with it. They didn't put a plan. But maybe in the future, those politicians are going to put a plan. For example, there is a plan about enforcing standardization. It's not available in Canada much. Europeans did it more than us. And when they buy products from us, they ask, do you apply environmental health and safety standard like ISO or Canadian standard even? Many companies don't apply those environmental health and safety standardization. So we hope to enforce this instead of telling people, I want money from your pocket, put it, I don't know where.
Thanks for that comment. And it's difficult to not make this a political issue because policy is so important in controlling greenhouse gases. So thank you for the comment. I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of ideology and misinformation that also goes into the political sphere around this piece. I'm not sure why that's happening because, again, the science is very clear that we need to address it. And you're right, Rod Phillips and Doug Ford do recognize that global warming is real. That took a little bit of work, though, because they were actually trying to take climate change out of, but anyway. So just in response to your comments directly, like Trudeau's climate plan, 70% of Canadian families will actually get more money than they spend as a result of this new carbon taxation or carbon pricing. And actually in BC, where they've already had carbon pricing for several years, the economy has not fallen apart. It's actually done very fine, and they've actually shown reductions in emissions. As compared to, if we look at Australia, where regulation and standardization, as you've pointed out, was tried, and there was no effect on emissions. So I think the data is actually already very clear from other jurisdictions what plans work and what doesn't. And I think there's a little bit of an adjustment that some of our politicians need to make if they truly want to be realistic in actually addressing climate change and not just giving window dressing about it. But maybe we'll just stop there on that point. Any other questions?
One was quickly on the car batteries, just the acidity of the battery itself, just quickly. But after that, another main thing is lately I've been really bothered by recycling. It really frustrates me. Like a lot of us aren't exactly recycling correctly. I'm just wondering, I'm starting to not want to recycle because like my dad's neighbor, he'll just put all the recycling in a garbage bag, and the garbage man comes and grabs the garbage bag because he's not going to have time to sort everyone's recycling. Also, I'll go to my friend's house and they'll get super offended if I go near their pile that's like, you know, something that's not correctly in the recycling. But the last thing, while I have this, sorry, you see all these Tim Horton cups and the McDonald's cups. Even at the Tim Hortons, they have pictures of the cup, you know, but everyone's recycling it, but it's wax. You see, like only the top part is recyclable, and all of us are pitching it in there. It's driving me nuts. Okay? And one more. One more, sorry. See these? We all recycle these cans. Aluminum. Aluminum is one of our easiest metals to recycle, right? So all those pans that we have over there that we use for cooking, everyone's throwing those in the garbage. Really? That's good. It's aluminum. You can use as well. But yeah, so I don't know how to speak to people without sounding like a crazy person. You know.
Well, you already heard from two crazy people today, so that's a very good point. I think, you know, like we look around and we see most people don't seem to care or don't seem to be doing the right thing. But I think, you know, if we're going to make a difference, we have to insist on doing the right thing, even if other people are not, and hope to influence people that way. You know, and we can't give up because that's not really an option. That's not an option. Acidity of batteries, I'm not sure. I don't know much about that. But.
So right now, electric cars are mostly powered by lithium-ion batteries. There is a chemical reaction that's required from the cathode to the anode in order to generate and store and generate the electricity. The recycling methodologies that are in place now generally contain any acidity that would be released to the environment because it's the goal is to use closed loop. And actually, some of the earlier EV batteries that were produced are now being used in electricity storage projects. So for example, where you have solar or wind are not available 24/7, right? So what you can do is use an old EV battery and you store the electricity that you generate in the middle of the day from the solar, and then you can use it in your house at night. So there's all kinds of ways of reusing those batteries. The other thing is that the technology is continuing to move forward. There will eventually be solid-state batteries. There's already testing underway in solid-state batteries, which will be even more effective and aren't acidic at all because they're solid-state. So I think those things will continue to improve, and we'll get more economies of scale. The more people are buying those products, they're going to get less expensive and more effective and to be used. I just wanted to bring forward, because we asked this question at the end of our talk here, and it was a really interesting resource that we came across. I'm just going to put this back up here. So you want to talk about it, Joyce?
Sure. So we're both Christian, and I know that most of you are, maybe all of you, and and so I think as Christians we do have a responsibility to our planet and to our fellow human being and to God in terms of looking after our planet. So does anybody want to, you know, discuss something, maybe something that they're thinking of, maybe what their responsibility would be as a Christian, as a human being?
So I really think our responsibility as, not even just a Christian, as a human being, is like you mentioned in the Bible, we have to be custodians of the earth. Is a present, and you know, you take care of your things. You get a new shiny phone, you put a case on it. Well, I hope you do. You get a car, you're always parking it really far. I wax it every twice a year. At least I do. Yeah, I know. Earl Wax always sucks. But yeah, so you try to take care of the things you were given because they are present, and we did work hard for the earth, and we do work hard right now, not just for us, but for future generations. At least, that's the amount of work we work on, especially like you guys are in science researching. You're not researching for here now, researching so to advance the knowledge of technology, right? I do sort of the same thing too. Right now, I'm dealing with shred. You guys know what shred is, to increase our knowledge. So I think we do have, you have a responsibility to increase our knowledge and to kind of keep this world not just for us, but for future generations. I think that's a problem. I don't want to be too political, but I think that's some policies right now are just like here and now, which, if the mindset is, hey, I'm going to die in 40 years, what's the big deal? Like, burn it to hell. You can't really do that, right? So.
Well said. Thank you.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what John said. One of the things that I believe our faith does a great job of doing is being open-armed and kind of sharing the love that Christ showed us. And I think this is a great example in doing that as custodians, as you guys put it, in that love through this knowledge by taking it upon ourselves to have the responsibility to sharing that knowledge with anyone and anyone who kind of would be interested in hearing it. What I mean by that is maybe not giving like such a beautifully put together presentation, but finding a way to put it into terms that people around you can understand. And I think that's the first step in making people aware around you to do that. And not in a way that forces people to make it stand, because that's not what our faith is about. If anything, it's about showing people how irresistible the love of Christ is. But at the same time, when people understand how beautiful the world around them is and how much we take for granted on a daily basis is, then having them and showing them enough information to have them make the decision itself. So I guess what I'm saying is we have the responsibility as Christians to be able to accommodate the people that may not be as fortunate to have such a beautifully put together and explicit and elaborate presentation like this heard, and the people who aren't here tonight to share it with them in the best way as possible, in the way that works for them, without in any way forcing them, but doing it in a way that comes from love, knowledge, and just a want to make an impact.
Thank you. That was great.
I love the presentation. Thank you so much. I'm just going to read this verse. It's Luke 19, and it's when the people are telling Jesus to silence his disciples, and he says, if I tell you, if they would keep quiet, the rocks would cry out in praise to me. And so I think about how often, like in the Psalms, creation is praising God. So creation is active and it's alive, and we're in community with it to give God glory. So out of that comes a beautiful responsibility we have to be stewards. And I think just a personal challenge I try and do to myself is every year, I'm like, what am I going to do differently this year to become a better environmental steward? And I think that's just one thing I do. And one thing that came to me this year is I think sometimes we need to start writing some of these companies. Like I'm thinking about my Keurig cups, right? And I just toss them in the garbage. I was thinking about all the people who are using these Keurig cups. And I'm like, what if I wrote a letter to somebody and we started kind of getting more active about writing letters to companies about their policies, about their packaging policies, about just something maybe on that level perhaps. And I had a question for our church actually that's ever since I knew this would happen. And my question was, as a community, as a church community, what can we do as a community? That I think this education is amazing. We also had a beautiful sermon on the environment and our responsibility. So I was really happy with that. But I guess my question, I don't know if we have time to answer it now, is collectively, what can we do?
Thank you very much.
And this Evangelical Christian Climate Initiative is signed by 300 senior evangelical leaders in the United States. And it has 4 claims in it, but I got to use my fancy laser pointer again here. But claim 3, I think, is talking about, in the last couple of commentators there, we're talking about, you know, driving this from the love that God gave us through Jesus Christ, and how everything can be done through love. That we need to care about climate change because we love God, the Creator, and Jesus our Lord, through whom and for whom creation was made. This is God's world, and any damage that we do to God's world is an offense against God himself. Christians must care about climate change because we are called to love our neighbors, to do unto others as we would do have them do unto us, and to protect and care for the least of those as though each was Jesus Christ himself. And Christians, noting the fact that most of the climate change problem is human-induced, are reminded that when God made humanity, he commissioned us to exercise stewardship over the earth and its creatures. Climate change is the latest evidence of our failure to exercise a proper stewardship and constitutes a critical opportunity for us to do better.
Thank you so much, and I was really sitting there and learning a lot. I loved everything you said, and I guess from a leadership perspective, always you think, what can we do? Definitely, this is God's creation, and we need to preserve it. So, I think Mariana asked about what did the church do. So basically, when we were designing and building the church, we wanted to be earth conscious. So the city of Markham would dictate that we do at least be certified for LEED silver. LEED silver means we have to, out of a whole lot of list, we had to pick and choose things that we can do in the building to be conscious about the environment. So some of these things would be, for example, the amount of natural light that's coming into the church in every room, so basically to decrease the use of electricity. Secondly, the storm water collection and using it, so all the water that falls in the whole property kind of funnels down to 2 big tanks, and we can use it, reuse it for irrigation, or like flushing the toilets and things like that. That don't have to do with human consumption, of course. Thirdly, to decrease the amount of asphalt, to put more stone, to put a certain amount of trees and grass and things like that on the property, using LED lights rather than regular lights, and we were able to do a large portion of the church in LED lighting rather than in regular lights. And actually, this coming week, Lord willing, you're going to see all the lights in the banquet hall change from regular light into LED light to reduce again all of that. We did consider the solar panels, and we did try to actually put it in, but at that time of design, the prices were way, way high above our budget. But maybe, hopefully, in the near future, if we can change to solar panels and maybe generate our own electricity. We are recycling, by the way, everything, but our company, because it's a private company, it does its own sorting. So some may feel that things go in random, like different bins or things like that. The company that we are with, they take everything and they sort it properly in every direction. So again, that's something that we try to do, saving electricity, water, all of these things. Also, all the flushes in the toilets and the faucets are also done to save some energy, and also it doesn't overflow. When you have a little bit of water coming down, it's not meant to frustrate people, but just meant to, you don't need to use 10 times if you're just washing your hands. Instead of using paper towel, we have the electrical one, so we can also save on that. There's many other things that we did here in the building to kind of be conscious about the environment. I'm sure there's a lot more that we can do and learn. And collectively, I think this talk today is an eye-opener, not only collectively, but individually in our own homes and families. But if there are certain ideas that we can explore together as a community, as a congregation, definitely we will do our best to pursue some of these ideas. And if I go and buy a Tesla now, no one wants to judge me, okay? Don't judge me. I don't know if I can afford it, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was listening to a CBC radio program. This was a few years ago, and there's a lady on the program, and she was living next to a wind turbine, and she was saying she's having all these negative health effects. I think it was mostly migraines, and it could have been other things. So my question to you is, if you live next to a wind farm, are there negative health effects, and is there a certain distance that one should be from them? Can you comment on that?
I don't think there's any actual scientific evidence that that is true. Like, most of the complaints have been anecdotal. I think, but what is true is PM 2.5, the air pollution, is, you know, there's tons of, if you did a search on Google Scholar for all the medical literature, there's tons of data on air pollution and links to various diseases, including more recently neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease and so forth. And actually noise, like when people live close to a highway, there's higher risk of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's as well. So I think, you know, like there's a lot of anecdotal stories and sort of, I think, fake science and fake news out there, and we can't just take them at face value. I think it really needs to be rigorously researched and studied, and we need to need to respect scientific truth as scientific truth, and really just sort of like do our homework to figure out what is really the truth, as opposed to what some people may be paid to say. You know, I think there's a lot of negative press about certain aspects of climate action that would actually help our planet and ourselves. Yeah, so we need to be careful about that. You want to say something?
I just wanted to add to that. I mean, I just grabbed my phone as sort of an illustration. I mean, in the past decade or two, it's become less and less fashionable to believe in science. And people are believing pseudoscience. They're believing whoever yells the loudest in the press without checking the facts. And this phone that we all use every day and love, this is built on science. This is based on fact. We are all entitled to our own opinion, but we're not all entitled to our own facts. So when we get into arguments about stuff like this, we need to go back to the facts, and that's what should actually be governing our society and our actions, is facts, not who's yelling the loudest or is making up the biggest story. And for some reason, I don't know if it's the internet or it's Facebook or what it is, but it's very clear. If you look at even poll data from Canadian citizens, there is a trend toward disbelieving science. And science is what has built our society to what it is in the last 100 years, and all the effects, the benefits we have in terms of health and sanitation and prosperity. And for some reason, we're actively choosing to ignore that. It's one of the reasons why we're so paralyzed at trying to respond to this crisis.
Thank you.
Just a very quick question, which should be easy to answer. I want to say thank you. I learned so much, and it's very eye-opening. I'm definitely going to think about where I put my McDonald's cup. Thanks, Angie. So the question is, because this really worries me when I see, I think it's great we're moving towards electric cars, but what worries me is I heard they don't go very far. And so I commute. So one thing I'm thinking about, I commute 2 hours a day to work, which is not great for the environment. But part of that is because rent is just so expensive in Toronto. And so I think maybe one area we can start to address it through policies is looking at the housing market for rent and ownership, because the more expensive things become, the more people are moving outside the city to commute in.
That's a good point.
Several of the electric cars that are coming on the market now, or have even been in the market the past year or two, are up to 500 kilometers in range. So actually the range is very good, and there's a lot more chargers that are being built now too. So places where you can charge at work, for example. So even if you forgot to charge the night before. One thing that people often forget with electric cars is that, unlike your gas car, when you leave the garage, you could be at 1/8 of a tank when you leave the garage, right? When you leave your garage with an electric car, you're always starting with basically a full battery because you charge it overnight, right? So you actually don't, it's not much of an issue. We both drive electric, and I've driven all over Ontario for my job, all the way up to Sault Ste. Marie and back, and I haven't had any problem whatsoever. Cars are getting to the point within the next couple of years, you're going to see a 500-kilometer range car available for about $40,000-$45,000, even without rebates, and then no gas. So it's getting there.
And I think I just wanted to share maybe one idea for your church to do. Maybe for events, get everyone to bring their own cup. That may be an option, right? Like, and just serve sort of like bulk coffee or bulk drinks, right? Because actually, I don't know whether you're aware, but plastic water bottles, which we're drinking from right now, contain microplastics. So I don't know if you've heard of that, but basically microplastics are plastic like particles that are so tiny that you can absorb them through your gut, and it goes into your bloodstream and is shown to be carcinogenic. So it's actually better to bring your own like stainless steel or glass or whatever, like, you know, non-BPA water bottle, and then fill it up.
Better for your health to drink municipal water out of a thermos than
Yep.
to drink bottled.
Yep. Even though it may not taste as good, but you can always use a Brita filter. And as a Christian, I also wanted to share that, you know, my passion before I did the training with Al Gore, which is mainly like Jeremy's idea, was I'm really passionate about women and children's rights, especially in the developing world. And we sponsor several children. And, you know, I kind of used to think that, oh, that's already awesome. I choose to mostly sponsor girls in the developing countries. But now I realize, after the training, that climate change is affecting, you know, all these people in developing countries much more disproportionately compared to affecting us. So we are the polluters. We are the people that are in rich countries, you know, burning most of the fossil fuels, consuming more, but then the people that are poor and vulnerable, the people that, as Christians, Jesus called us to look after, they are the ones that are impacted the most. And, you know, what good is my sponsorship doing to these children if their whole village is, like, flattened by a storm and they can't rebuild? So that is, you know, and I realize that climate change is the big destabilizer of really any situation at all. And I also learned that women and children are actually affected more than men by climate change. You might think that's surprising. But in some parts of the world, women are not allowed to go out without men. And so they're often the last to hear news about, you know, impending storm or flood or whatever. So they're often the last to leave. So there's more, you know, like deaths of women. And also a lot of women and children are indoors when they're doing their cooking. And they're still burning kerosene, which is causing a lot of indoor air pollution that's causing respiratory conditions in children and women. And so, you know, part of the solution to climate change, such as, you know, the solar panels you see being installed on the huts, is actually a win-win situation. It's a win for the earth, but also it's an immediate win for the health of these people that are, you know, using that currently using the antiquated technology, the kerosene, burning kerosene just for food, for cooking food. Thank you. Any other comments? Saber?
I was just curious if you guys happen to know any other professional designations such as LEED out there with regards to green and environmentally conscious design. In case anyone doesn't know, LEED is a green building design with regards to construction engineering. I don't know about if there's more beyond that, because LEED is at the forefront. I'm just wondering if there's anything else.
He's an engineer with expertise in green building. The LEED certification is perhaps the best known because it's well publicized, and companies like to use it for sort of green credit almost with their consumers and their customers, but it's perhaps not the most it's not the most commonly used. There's other standards that are being used amongst engineers and building designers that are less fancy, but still very important. I don't have familiarity with that, but I could certainly connect you with someone who does.
Yeah, like I think, well, one of our engineering friends who trained with us in Mexico City with Al Gore, he says that you can currently basically build a net zero house right now. Like there's all the technology that is available, and he doesn't understand why more people aren't doing it. So all the new houses that are being built, they definitely have the potential to be net zero quite easily and very cost effectively.
As a Christian or just regular human, yeah, I don't know. I didn't do anything, honestly, to earn life in the first place. I didn't do a thing to earn life. I didn't do a thing to earn life. None of us earned, and it's a gift, right? So. I was thinking, so actually I wanted to share, I was in Bulk Barn recently, and they're trying to get rid of bags. You know those bags that we're constantly using? We go and we use 1 million bags. So they're now using glass. Like if you have glass, you can go there with your glass container and you can weigh your things and leave, okay, without using bags. For example, so Bulk Barn is a group that's trying anyways. They're a big user of plastic bags. So that would be really cool if more and more places have reusable items like that. So Bulk Barn is one that is participating. Actually, they're also selling those straws that you can reuse. Also, really, really cool, turtles have been passing away regarding because of pollution. A lot of those beer cans, you know, they come in packs of 6, and the little rings have animals getting caught up in those things. So there's a company that created beer holders that are edible. So if the turtle gets stuck, it can eat its way out. Yeah, in general, more innovative ideas like this is amazing. And I was wondering for you guys, is there a way to force the government to, you know, at the grocery store that we're more and more encouraged to use reusable bags. You know, half of us aren't doing it. You know, or I don't know, cutlery. Like, there's no reason we're constantly using cutlery every single day in all cafeterias. You know, I don't know. It would be really neat to have some type of system where everyone's kind of forced to use those. Like, we all have a choice, but I don't see why we have a choice. You know.
And I think, you know, these are all really good points. And don't be discouraged, because, you know, every little action can have, you know, can trigger more action, right? We don't know where our action is going to end, right? And just act from your heart. And Al Gore reminded us that for every big civil rights revolution, any revolution at all, it starts with a small group of grassroots people that cared, that did the right thing, that keep on doing the right thing despite people thinking they're crazy.
Hi, so I just wanted to say, so thank you for the presentation, and I want to say, so thank you for Father Bishoy, you know, for the reassurance, because I was getting worried where to throw this out. But I wanted to ask with regards to, on the worldwide stage, like, I know, like in North American countries, we can collect, we can organize, you know, to put pressure on governments, but like, what about in countries where that kind of, you know, activism is not possible? Like, so what's being done on that level? Like, is there something, you know, like at the UN or something to put pressure on those kind of countries? I was just wondering if you knew more about that.
For sure, yeah. So the UN and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're scientifically based, they're international, and they produce data that's constantly monitoring the effects of what's happening in the planet. But the other thing that's happening with that is there's a policy arm. So The Paris Accord, which you may have heard of, over 190 countries signed on for that. And then every year they have another meeting called the COP, which is where all those countries have to come back and weigh in on what progress they've made. Every country that signed the Paris Accord had to make a solid plan as to how they were going to commit and meet their greenhouse gas reduction emission targets. And every year they have to come back and report, are you succeeding? And if not, what are you doing to address it? So that's sort of the check and balance. So, you know, sometimes people will say, if you're talking to them about climate change, they'll say, well, you know, Canada only represents like 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so why should we care? Sad that some people would say that, considering if we're consuming so much resources and we're affecting all the countries that can't do anything and aren't as developed as us, but nevertheless, it is a good point. So that's where you can say, hey, we're not the only country. All the major countries of the world have signed on to this. The US is still in on the Paris Accord right now. Even though Trump says that he's backing out, he can't actually back out until, ironically, this is so beautiful, poetic justice, the day after the next election. He can't actually pull out of that accord. So tell all your friends in the US, don't vote Trump. And the US can still stay in on the Paris Accord. So that's really where all that's being driven. Hope that helps. Yeah.
Steal the mic and curb great discussion, but maybe you guys can stick around a couple minutes later if someone has lingering questions or anyone has any lingering questions. Just a couple announcements before we end the night. Just in keeping with the theme of the new year, this series, I don't know if you were new, but you are part of a new series called Have an Opinion. And hopefully now we do have an opinion, and there is only one opinion you should have. But next week, we will have a guest speaker, Father Raymond D'Souza, who is a columnist for The Globe in Mail. And someone else, and Greg Moros. He will be discussing Christians in politics. Should we have a voice, and how should we do it as Christians? And then following that week, we will have Weed is Now Legal. What's the harm in it and using it now? And that will be done by Father John Buttress, and he's bringing in the perspective of him being a physician. And then the final week will be Women in Ministry. Where are we now? Literally, where are we? And that's the end of the series. There are a lot of new faces. If you want to come to me afterwards, just so I can grab your email address, I only send out an email once a week just to let you know what the following week's discussion is going to be about. That's it, I promise, just one weekly email. And that's it. I think we will end right now. If you guys can help us clean the tables, put away the chairs and the tables, that would be great. There is still a lot of food at the over there. It is chicken, it's not beef, so it's fine. And that is it. Can we stand up for a quick prayer? And would you like to bless us with a prayer? Okay.